Hello and welcome to the Tales from the Oval. And with me is Jon Surtees. And Jon, this is so exciting, isn't it? Because we are now on episode 10,
Oh my
so we
word.
only have one to go. And
Yeah.
well, you're not eagle-eyed, are you, if you're a listener? Whatever the equivalent of being an eagle-eyed person is. Um,
Eagle-eared.
attentive listeners will have noted that we have done the greatest innings ever played at the Oval, but we have not yet given our nomination for the greatest spell of bowling ever at the Oval. I guess it would be fair to
No.
say that the Oval is kind of generally been thought of more as a batsman's paradise than a bowler's, hasn't it? Really, over the decades.
Yeah, I think I think yeah, I think if anything, that's what the story is, the narrative is. I think in general what the Oval is known as, hopefully, I would like to think is just a place where you get a brilliant cricket wicket, where bowlers who bowl brilliantly will get their due out of the pitch, and batters who bat superbly will also get their due. It's just a wicket that creates good cricket, hopefully. But I think certainly the narrative has been slightly over the years that batters may have had their way slightly. Yeah.
There speaks the Surrey official. So I mean, assuming that that it is slightly better for batsmen than for bowlers, I mean, it makes the great performances by bowlers all the more impressive. So we have mentioned some of the
Sure. Yeah.
potential candidates on this series already. So we talked about
Hmm.
Spofford, the Demon, and his tremendous match figures of
Yeah.
he took 14 wickets for 90 runs in that great match that we talked about that gave birth to the Ashes. And more recently,
Yeah.
in the last episode, we were talking about the great Surrey team of the 50s, and Bedser, Laker, Locke all put in incredible performances, didn't they? And you wanted to mention Tom
Yeah.
Richardson
Yeah.
even earlier than Spofford, was he?
Yeah, Tom Richardson, yeah, 10 for 45, June 1894. Tom Richardson and
Yeah, okay.
Jim Laker both took all 10 in the innings for Surrey at the Oval. Jim Laker against Australia in 1956, May 1956. Yeah, I mean, taking all 10 in the innings, I think you've got to mention them in the context of when you're talking about the greatest spells of bowling ever at the ground. Certainly, yeah,
And then the three more
and
recent
then
performances we should perhaps
more
mention.
recent, yeah,
So the best test figures at the Oval ever uh, were Matthias Muralitharan in 1998, and he took 16 for 220. Um,
yeah,
Devon Malcolm, of
incredible
course,
game,
one of the all-time great test performances, 9 wickets for 57 in the second innings in 1994. You guys are
yeah,
history. And
yeah,
that phrase itself, of course, has become part of cricket history. Everybody quotes it. And then
yeah,
you were very keen on
yeah. Put it on a
mentioning
mug.
the most recent one. So last year, 2023, Stuart Broad's farewell
Yeah.
bowling performance, which was more about, it was less in the figures, wasn't it? And it was more the swagger and chutzpah with which he said goodbye to cricket.
Yeah, the chutzpah and the occasion of it, and I think one of the things, as we've talked about, Tom, that we've come to realise and come to showcase, I think, about the history of this ground is the way that history repeats itself, and I think it's Stuart Broad's career. Um, Almost the first time he made himself known at the Oval was to that 2009 Ashes Test where he took 5 wickets in the afternoon and turned that game on its head, and then 2023, all that time later, he was still there. And you're right; it's about the theatre and the chutzpah and
Yeah.
the swapping of the bails and the headband and the fact that he'd pre-announced it as his final test. It was just as an occasion. I think there's certainly been many more impressive spells of bowling technically and whatever, but just purely for the grandiosity of the occasion and the theatricality of it. I think it deserves a mention.
Yeah. And we said the Oval is a great place for farewells, and Broad milked that for all it was worth. But the spell that we have
Yeah,
chosen is by
yeah,
it was by a very young bowler, only 22. And as with Grace's innings, it's a spell that is great because it kind of transcends the details of the match itself. It's about much more
yeah,
than just a great performance in purely cricketing terms. And I think that this spell of bowling, even more than Grace's innings, it tells you something important and significant about how cricket has changed and evolved, but also about how um, the Oval has changed, and about the streets and the areas that surround the Oval in South London.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I couldn't agree more.
the spell of bowling that we've chosen, it exists in the context of one of the most significant post-war developments in British history, which is the transformation of Britain into a multiracial society. And obviously, because
Yeah.
cricket has been played in Commonwealth countries, so India, Pakistan, the West Indies, that's something that's been very apparent in cricket. Loads of people who've come to Britain from those countries have brought an obsession with cricket with them. And we've seen it in the evolution of people who play in England, often for England, but also the fans who go and watch the matches. And at the Oval, I think the crowds and then the players through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s reflected particularly the arrival in South London of people from the Caribbean. And so the symbolic moment that is
Yeah.
associated with that is the arrival of the Windrush at Tilbury in Essex on the 22nd of June, 1948. And the Windrush brought
Yeah.
492 people from the Caribbean. Many of them had fought for Britain in the war. They felt that they were coming to, they were British citizens. And they they were lots of them went to ended up in Brixton, and they Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Lipton, who at the time was the MP for Brixton. I mean, I simply cannot imagine a lieutenant colonel being the MP for Brixton now, but he stood up in the
Yeah.
House of
Yeah.
Commons and he
Yeah.
said that all South Londons will make them welcome. I don't know if he spoke like that, but I imagine that he did. And it was reported in the
Yes.
press, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Lipton's welcome. He has given 40 Jamaicans who came to Britain on the Empire Windrush and are now staying in the Clapham Common deep shelters a public welcome at the Brixton Astoria. So why are they going to
Yeah.
Brixton? Well, the immediate answer is because the Labour Exchange, the nearest Labour Exchange to Clapham Common, where they were being put up, was on Cold Harbour Lane in Brixton, which we've
Hmm.
already mentioned as the place where an alternative ground might have been built rather than the Oval. So kind of, there's a cricket
Yes.
link there.
Yes.
And of course, for
Yes.
the people from the Caribbean who began to settle in Brixton over the 50s and into the 60s, the Oval was the nearest ground. So obviously it was the place that they would go to.
Hmm.
And I guess that the first time that West Indies supporters made themselves known in the Oval was in 1950, when the West Indies won
Hmm.
the fourth test and the series 3-1. And this was the famous series that saw the West Indies get their first victory at Lord's. That was the subject of the famous calypso, Victory Calypso, that I think was composed by Lord Kitchener and sung by Lord
Yeah.
Beginner, both of whom had sailed on the Windrush. And that was celebrating the deeds of Ramadan and Valentine, those little pals of mine, as the lyrics of the
It's
calypso
brilliant.
had it.
It's
And so that was
it's
the great
absolutely
victory
brilliant.
at Lord's, but then the West Indies won again at the
Yeah.
Oval. So that was brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my more controversial takes in life is that there should be more sporting music. I'm one of those people that's slightly sad you don't get FA Cup final singles anymore and that sort of
Well,
thing. So I think the music composed and released to celebrate those victories. I think it's brilliant. More of that sort of thing in my book.
well, I mean, I'm sure that you've heard, Cricket, Lovely Cricket. That's kind of very, very famous. But were you also aware
Yeah.
that Lord Kitchener wrote the Alec Bedser Calypso? I had no idea until
I was.
I
Yeah, I
researched
was. I
this.
was aware of this.
So it was
Yeah.
actually it's
Yeah.
about Bedser's performance in the Test series. It came out in 1953. But obviously, the reason
Yeah.
that Lord Kitchener is interested in Bedser, I'm assuming, is because he's going to the Oval and he's seeing Bedser perform there, in the glory days of that we were talking
Yeah.
about last week. And so you
Yeah.
see there that
I think that's a fair assumption.
yeah, I think so. So there's the emergence there of
Yeah.
a completely new demographic, which is basically Surrey fans who are supporting the West Indies, and over the 50s and
Yeah.
60s, that their numbers grow. And again, it's kind of really interesting stats. I was looking this up. So by the 1970s, just under half of all Black people in the UK are living in London, and a majority of those are living in South London. So it's not surprising in that context that in 1976, when the West Indies come on tour again, and this time they're playing a 5-match series, they arrive at the Oval 2-0 up, and it is a massive, massive occasion for all West Indies supporters in Brixton, Lambeth generally,
Yeah,
South London. And I'm sure you've read Simon Lister's book Fire in Babylon about the Great West
yeah,
Indies team of the 70s and 80s, and he quotes
yeah.
two fans who went there. So the first one was a guy called Martin Adrian, and he says of it, the Oval was a celebration test. It was an event. You were going somewhere. So for a day at the cricket, you could well wear a suit. It was like your Sunday best. And at the time, for a fair number of those people, cricket would have been second only to church. And then the other guy he quotes is Trevor
Love it.
Nelson, the
Love it.
DJ, and he's a radio DJ.
Oh yeah,
And he says of it,
iconic individual.
so he
The
says
great Trevor Nelson.
so we've had one comparing it going to church, but then he compares it to a carnival. Everyone had tin cans. There was a sense of freedom of expression. I was a kid, but now I can remember that day and understand why there was such a noise. And anyone listening to this with any familiarity with West Indies cricket, with great bowling performances at the Oval, will know who we are talking about when we talk about the greatest bowling performance ever in the history of the Oval. And that person, of course, is Michael Holding, Whispering Death, the nickname I think that Dickie Bird gave him for his performance in that match. And John, when we talked about W.G. Grace, we couldn't have W.G. Grace, could we? And we couldn't have Spofforth.
We tried.
But we have got the great man himself. We have got Michael Holding, who is joining us all the way from the Cayman Islands in the Caribbean. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to Tales
Thank
from
you
the
very
Oval.
much, Tom and Jon. Thanks for having me on your program. It's my pleasure.
The honour is all ours. So, did I get it right?
All
you were
ours.
22 on that
Yes, I was
tour.
born in February 1954. So yes, I was 22 years old on that tour. A bit wet behind the ear. Didn't know a lot about cricket, much less England. But I came up on that tour, and up until that test match, I would have to say that I was having a reasonable tour. Nothing outstanding. I missed one test match at Trent Bridge. I was ill for that test match. But then I had played the 3 others leading up to the Oval Test. And I had only taken 14 wickets in those 3 test matches. So, I couldn't say I was setting the place afire.
But can I just ask you, before we get onto the cricket itself, to what extent were you aware of what your performances as West Indians in that series against England meant for people, say, in Brixton or in South
I wasn't
London?
really aware. The first time I went to the Oval was when West Indies played against Surrey early in the summer. It was a warm-up game. And I think Surrey declared and set the West Indies a target. And Clive Lloyd in the team meeting, the gathering before everybody went out back onto, not everyone, the openers went out to bat. He said, listen, it's not important for us to win this game. We are here to win test matches. This is just a warm-up game. A lot of you guys have never been to England, don't play a lot of cricket under these circumstances and these conditions. Go and get acclimatized. So we did not chase the target. But when we did not chase the target and the fans in the stands realizing that we were not trying to chase the target, they got upset. And, they started to abuse us from the stands. And that's the first time I sort of had an inkling of what cricket meant to the Caribbean people in England, because I asked Gordon Greenidge about it later on the bus. And he was trying to tell me, these guys, not just guys, girls, everyone were from the Caribbean were under a bit of pressure living in England and meant to feel inferior. So they wanted us, the West Indies team, to win every game so that they could walk on the streets feeling proud and saying to themselves and to whoever asked, I am from where these guys are from. These guys are champions. I feel identifying with them. But as I said, 1976, although Greenwich told me about that, I didn't really feel exactly what it meant, because I wasn't really in the society. I wasn't mixing with these guys outside of just when they came to cricket, because that was my first time in England. I hadn't played county cricket or anything like that to really know what the society was like. That grew on me later on when I started to come back in the 80s regularly. And I really got the impression and knew exactly what it meant for the West Indian people in England, for the West Indies team to do well.
So can I just ask you, in that context, before the series began, the England captain Tony Greig was being interviewed, and notoriously he said, you know, the West Indies come with a great reputation, and when they're on top, they're formidable, but we, England, you know, we're going to make them grovel. And he used that word grovel, and that was a word that got flung back at him again and again over the course of the summer. Did that have any impact on you?
It's
And if
had a
so,
great
what?
impact, not just on me, but on the entire West Indies team. I remember it clearly. Those days, 1976, West Indies team coming to England, we did not stay in five-star hotels. And a lot of the hotels that we stayed in, the only television set was down in the lobby. And it was a Sunday. The touring team didn't play cricket on a Sunday those days. So we were free to go and do whatever we wanted. And as I said, I'd never been to England. I had never played county cricket. I didn't know too many people in England. So I was back at the hotel. The rest of the guys who knew a bit more about England and had played county cricket had gone off doing their shopping, visiting friends, that sort of a thing. So I was at the hotel. I went downstairs into the lobby. I don't even remember which hotel, which lobby it was. And luckily, the television set was on the BBC showing the Sunday League game. And they had gone down to Sussex and they were interviewing Tony Greig in what seemed to be like someone's office. And I never forget it. He was there with a cup of tea. And when you say that he said that England would make us grovel, Tony Greig did not say England, because I'll never forget what he said. He said, I, and it's almost as if by a second thought he said, with the help of Closey and a few others, will intend to make them grovel. I'll never forget that.
That's right,
And
yes.
of course, I reported back to the team because a lot of the guys hadn't seen it. I reported back to the team exactly what had taken place. And then eventually it started to come out, that what Tony Greig had said. But it lifted us. It made us think to ourselves, oh, this is what he thinks of us. We are only good when we're on top. Everybody is good when they're on top. We're going to show you that we are just good. So it lifted us a great deal.
And so,
Wow.
and so,
I mean, what
and
an
so
amazing way to hear that.
and so to begin with,
Just-
I mean, the first two matches are drawn, but then the third test at Old Trafford, and you mentioned Closey, Brian Close, a man who kind of stands there and has things thrown at him just for fun. And effectively, that is kind of what happened, wasn't it, at Old Trafford? Was that you said that you weren't creating much of a reputation for yourself that series, but I mean, you kind of were, because that was there was a kind of famous passage of play where Close just stood there, and then he came off and kind of revealed the tattoo left by the balls on his chest. So was that a feeling that you were? Was it the fact that Greig had mentioned Close in particular?
No,
Did that
not at
fire you
all.
up for that,
Not
or
at
not?
all. Everything was being targeted at Tony Greig. He had mentioned Brian Close, yes, but nothing was targeted specifically at Brian Close. It was all about beating England and beating Tony Greig in particular. When Tony Greig came to the crease, all the fast bowlers found another yard or two. That's just metaphorically, of course. Nobody can bowl a yard faster all of a sudden. But when he was at the crease, the other English batsmen didn't want to be there with him because they felt it as well. But that situation there with Closey at Old Trafford,
Yeah.
it wasn't the greatest of pitches. People can tell you about that pitch. It had a crack running straight down the middle of the pitch. And whenever the ball hit that crack, it just took off. And that picture that they keep on showing of Brian Close with all those tattooed marks all over his body, that is actually from 1960 against Wes Hall. That was not 60, whatever year it was, 66 or whatever year it was. It was against Wes Hall.
63,
it was not
was it?
against the West Indies team of 1976. And if you look closely at the picture, you'll realize that Closey in that picture looked a little bit younger than he did in 1976. But because of the story and the euphoria of
Not quite as bald.
Brian Close getting all those bounces in 1976, they just painted that picture in. It's not 1976. I remember hitting Closey twice. He had about 6 or 7 bruises on his body in that picture.
So But West Indies had a decisive victory over England at Old Trafford by, what was it, kind of 400 odd runs. I mean, it was a monster victory. And then you won again at Headingley in the fourth test. So you were 2-0 up. So there was no way that England could get back. But they were clearly playing for pride at the Oval. And the other, I suppose, the other context for that match, apart from Greg's grovel comment, was the fact that there was an incredible drought that summer. It was really hot. It was really dry. And so when you arrived back at the Oval, what was your sense of what the impact of the weather had been on the pitch and the prospects for a result in the match?
I don't think we had high hopes of really winning that test match. Just having a look at the pitch itself, it was just as brown as the outfield, because we haven't any pictures of that entire pitch and square and field in 1976. There was no difference in color anywhere. It was entirely brown. The pitch was flat, grassless. And if you have any black and white video, it had to be black and white those days, of the match itself, you'd see that no ball bounced above any batsman's waist. They could not get the ball to bounce anywhere higher than perhaps the top of the knee or perhaps the top of the pads. So it was a pitch that was laid out there that people should just make runs. Over 1,000 runs were scored in the first innings alone. So if you have a look at that alone, you realize how good it was for batting.
Yeah. So West Indies bat first. They make 687 for 8. I mean, that's Len Hutton-esque, isn't it, John? I mean, that's a lot of runs. And Viv Richards scores 291.
I'm going to bounce back. Yeah, I'm going to bounce that back at you, because I think that is very, very harsh. So Mikey, Tom, and I over the last few episodes have been speculating that Len Hutton probably wasn't the greatest batter in the world to watch in terms of his the way. If you look at the numbers and the way that he scored his runs, he took a long time, and there was very little acceleration. But I think to liken Viv Richards' 291 in 1976 to a Hutton-esque effort, I think is very unfair.
John, I was talking purely in terms of the maths, not in terms of the style. So that was
the numbers.
That was his second double century of the series, wasn't it? I think
Viv,
and one of the all-time great innings, which actually we could have mentioned in our roundup of great innings, which maybe we should have done. But and it kind of don't nine of the England players end up having a bowl? Greg is getting so desperate by this point. And so, as you said, then England actually, I mean, they score 400 odd. Dennis Amos scores a double century. But someone takes 8 for 92 on this seeming featherbed. And Michael, who's that?
Let me try and wrap my memory. But as we said at the beginning, I was 22 years old. I was young, I was fit. The sun was shining, because my first time in England, to be honest, when I arrived in May, I was shivering. It eventually got warmer, and then by the time we got to the Oval, it was really, really hot. So I was feeling good. But even if, as I said, if you look back at some of those videos, I would start the over in my sweater. I still had my sweater on for the beginning of some of those overs, and then I'd take it off after the first ball. So for a young 22-year-old, wow. I was just feeling good, and everything went well. I would never, ever try and tell anyone that I knew everything about fast bowling at 22 years old. Because if you think you know everything at 22, you're not going to get very far. That means you have stopped learning. But everything just worked for me that test match.
But but one thing that you clearly knew was
that was obvious. As I said, the ball was not bouncing very high at all. And again, if you look back at the video, I remember some of the things. Dickie Bird was operating from my end, the Vauxhall Road end, most of the time. I bowled one spell from the pavilion end where Dickie wasn't standing, but every time after that I was from the Vauxhall Road end. And Dickie Bird gave out David Steele on the front foot LBW to me. Steele was upset because Steele was thinking, I'm on the front foot. How can he be giving me out? But it was the nature of the pitch. Dickie knew the ball was not going to go over the top. and he gave him out because that
Yeah.
was just the nature
Yeah.
of the pitch.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you bowl
I
Tony
bowled
Greig?
Tony Greig twice, I think, in that test match.
And what was the reaction of
I
the
don't
crowd?
remember on which occasion. I think perhaps both occasions they ran out onto the field. And then, there was a bit of a pause because those days used to have people sitting down on the grass just inside, outside the boundary, inside the actual stand itself, because they used almost the entire area. But I think there might have been a little bit of a gap between where the
Yeah.
stand actually started and the boundary actually was. And you had a few people sitting there because you had police officers on that area as well, trying to prevent people from running out onto the field. But they just ran out, and the police officers, I don't think they were that serious about it. They knew they were not going to do anyone any harm, because that's the days before you had all these attacks on
Yeah.
people and all that sort of thing. So they would just follow them out onto the field and quietly usher them off, and everything would go back to normal. And Dickie Bird tells a story. I don't know if it's true, because Dickie,
So
is after dinner speeches and all that, might have been making this up. But Dickie says that someone, a West Indian, ran out there and gave him £5 because he couldn't get to me, and said to Dickie, "Give Mikey hold this £5 for me." Dickie said it's in the Yorkshire Building Society.
Of course he did. Of course he did.
Sure.
Mikey, can I ask you one question on this? You talked about how the fans are so close to the field and all of that. One of the things that people have told me about, we had a seminar here a few years ago talking to some fans who had been at that game and trying to understand their experience. One of the things that people constantly have talked about during that and others is the way the grounds smell. Because in terms of the food that people were bringing, and I think some of maybe obviously smoking was allowed in the stands in those days, and it wasn't necessarily just straightforward cigarettes that were being smoked in the stands. What was it like is that true? Did it
To
smell
be
incredible?
honest,
What was it
John,
like to
I
play in
couldn't
that
smell
atmosphere?
anything out on the field. Maybe if you're in the stands, you definitely smell whatever there was happening in the stand. But out on the field, especially a large expanse like the Oval,
Surely you could smell fear.
I think I could see fear more than smell it. But it was a great atmosphere, a fantastic atmosphere. Unfortunately, you don't get that atmosphere anymore because the way that the tickets are being sold. Because I've spoken about this as well, John. I've spoken about this on so many occasions in the past, that what has turned off a lot of the West Indian fans, and people think it's because West Indians are not doing well. Not true. They are not doing well, and yes, winners will always attract big crowds. But West Indians, way back then, they would have someone, like as you said, Tom, so many people from the West Indies living in Brixton. They would perhaps know each other. And someone would be tasked to go to the Oval and buy 20 tickets, 30 tickets. They would all get those tickets in a bunch, sitting together. And that has been stopped. There's no way you're going to have people
Yeah.
being able to go to the Oval individually at different times and get tickets sitting together. And that is what they wanted. They wanted it to be together where they could share their drinks, share their food, have fun together. That isn't possible anymore. And I'm sorry that that is the situation. I think people need to look at that. I've said it so many times and it's been ignored, but anyway, I'll say it again.
Yeah. So Trevor
Yeah,
Nelson in
yeah,
his
that's a really interesting take. Yeah,
in his
yeah.
account, he said, here people were selling fried fish and other food. My dad brought a massive hamper for everyone who came with us, chicken sandwiches, stuff to share. He was joking with his friends. I'm almost certain I witnessed someone cooking in the ground. So that sense of it as a huge social occasion. I mean, it sounds
It was,
amazing.
and it's the same
Just
thing in the
sounds
Caribbean, or it was the
really
same thing in the Caribbean. I remember when I was a kid, and my parents were going to go to cricket on a Saturday in Jamaica, Sabina Park. That Friday night, we're all in the kitchen preparing food for Saturday because everyone will be taking their food to the game. Those days, people weren't able to buy food at the ground. There were concessions all over the ground that you could go and buy a drink and buy your food and all that. So you took your own food, you took your own drink. And Friday evening, because during the week, whatever was happening during the week, people were going to work. But Saturday, everyone was going to cricket. So Friday night, we were all there preparing. I was a kid, I wasn't really preparing. I couldn't prepare anything, but I was in the mix, hanging around, looking at people. If somebody wanted a bottle of something to be passed, I would pass it to them. And that is how Friday evening and Friday night developed, going into cricket on Saturday.
That's so great. The other thing, Mikey, that I love about that, which I've been told about that game, one of the great privileges of my life was a few years ago when I never realised that you two had never met, and I got the chance to introduce you to David Rodigan, who was DJing at the Oval on a day when you were here commentating. One of
another
the
Michael
great,
as well,
the great
John.
men.
It's David
Yeah, so the
Michael
music-
Jon Rodigan.
The
Sorry?
music and the noise. So the music and
Oh,
the
yes,
noise, were you aware of
definitely.
that?
Definitely.
You couldn't smell anything, but the music of that, because
Oh
that was
yes, we
part
heard
of the
there was
background, wasn't it, as well?
a fella there
for
with a
that match?
conch shell. We would hear the conch shell. There was a drummer. We'd hear even individual voices sometimes who would shout out when it was a little bit quieter, and you would hear that voice. You wouldn't recognize who it was, but you would hear that individual voice. So we were well aware of that. The smell, no, but the sounds, yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the things, Tom, that Rodigan has talked to me about is that 1976 is such it's obviously an incredibly vital year for music in London, and you got punk in 1976, and then punk ultimately. The evolution of punk was when people like the Clash and whatever started listening to reggae, and when a lot of the music came over from the Caribbean to influence that, and ska and all of that, and yeah, Rodigan was saying, yeah, some of the beatboxes that people would bring down to the Oval in 76, he just said he felt that it was a real
The ground was literally
manifestation of London's
shaking.
kind of
like
a real manifestation of that musical summer.
So the impression when you read what the English batsman had to say about it is that it was quite intimidating. So, Mikey, you talked about how English batsmen didn't want to bat with Greg. So this is Dennis Amiss, who of course got a double century. Before Greg came in, they were bowling at a nice pace of about 85 miles an hour. I don't know whether you agree with that. Maybe it's being rude. But when Tony came to the wicket, it went up to about 90 and 3 bouncers and over. I've never been as pleased to see an England captain bowled. I mean, I don't know whether he's right about the bouncers, because you're saying you
Not
weren't
at the
bowling
Oval.
bouncers. But then, so the West Indies, you finished 252 ahead, even though England have scored over 400. So you could enforce the follow-on, but Clive Lloyd doesn't, because he wants to rest you, I guess, and it's a kind of flat wicket. And so Greenwich and Fredericks go out, and they just smack the England bowling all over the place, kind of 180 odd for no wicket. And isn't this the time when Greg does the famous, he goes over to the West Indies supporters and he falls down to his knees and kind of begs for forgiveness?
Well,
Is that right?
Almost. What happened is that when the West Indies declared and we were walking off the field after we had set England whatever target we had set them, the people in the stands, all the spectators and supporters in the stands, started to shout, "Grovel, Greggy, grovel. Grovel, Greggy, grovel." And the last few paces as he was walking off the field, as he got to the boundary's edge, he went down on his hands and knees and crawled to the first step of the pavilion, and then stood up and walked in.
All right.
So what did you make of that, Mikey? How did that make you guys feel? Was that
No,
enough,
we were
or
upset.
were you still
definitely upset.
still upset?
And John, what you have to remember also is that the guys who did not play county cricket did not know Tony Greig at all. And I was one of them. I thought he was being racist. Years after that, when I got to meet the man and I spent so much time with him in the commentary box, even at his home, all over the world, I got to realize that Tony Greig was not a racist. He used the wrong word. He perhaps didn't understand the connotations behind the word. And of course, that just spurred us on. But I got to know the man. And I know if anybody's going to tell me he's a racist, they'll have to prove that to me. The man that I met, or perhaps people change, I have no idea. But the man that I met was not a racist.
And at the time, when you didn't know
fascinating.
him, presumably the fact that he was South African was also
Yes,
an
definitely.
added layer to
Well,
that.
it all came
Because
together
it's
in a
the
talk.
age of apartheid.
He's a white South African playing for England because he cannot play for South Africa. That is what is in our head. He's from the apartheid regime. He knows apartheid, and this is just the manifestation of him and his life. Why he says this. This is what we are thinking, and me in particular, who had never met the man, didn't know anything about him. So that is just the image that we had.
Yeah. So that's all the incentive you need when Lloyd declares, and let me look it up. Let me check. So England are set 435 for victory, and they have what, about 40 minutes on the fourth
Tommy,
day.
you're asking me to remember
And
details. No, that I have no
You don't get a
chance of
wicket, right?
remembering.
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you. So I don't think the West Indies take a wicket on the evening of the fourth. You know, England have been set this short time. They make. Let me have a look. They reach 43 without loss, and then the next morning, the morning of the fifth, Whispering Death comes gliding in, and you get rid of the openers, and then you bowl Balderston, and whoosh, you end up taking 6 for 57. And among those 6 wickets is Tony Greig, bowled the second time in the match. This time, previous time had been for 12. This time for 1. That must have been
every time we got Tony Greig out, we rejoiced. I think, again, looking back at the film of those days, when I got him out bowl, I think when I jumped, I perhaps jumped 12 feet in the air with pumping my right fist up in the air. And then, of course, surrounded by all the team. I think Collis King might have been at bat pad at the time. I think he was the first one to reach me. And then all the slips and everybody came charging in. If I can just relate one story about that earlier on as well, that not a lot of people are aware of. You mentioned that West Indies had a lead of 252 or something like that and could have enforced the follow on. Well, I was bowling when the 9th wicket went down. And I was on a hat trick, actually. I'd taken 2 wickets in 2 balls. And this was the last wicket now. I'm on a hat trick, and Lloyd calls everyone together. So, again, 22 years old, you're bowling, taking wickets, you're on a hat trick. I am walking into this gathering, and I'm thinking to myself, Lloyd, they must have some serious plans for this hat trick ball, When I got in and he started to talk, he had nothing to say about the hat trick ball. He was saying, listen, we are not going to enforce the follow on. Anybody else disagrees with that? And of course, I'm just there dumbfounded. Why isn't he talking about my hat trick? It's 22 years old. You're thinking about yourself. Lloyd is thinking about the team. A lot of people talk about Clive Lloyd. He had such a great team. He did not.
But you were part of the
great
team.
Captain. The man thought about everything, and that little gathering, he said, we are not enforcing the follow on. We want the fast bowlers to get a bit of rest. It's a good batting pitch. We'll pile up some more runs. Anybody disagrees with this? He didn't just enforce that. He asked, everybody okay with this? That was the man.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
West Indies reap the reward. They win, and they win the series 3-0. But Mikey, more importantly, you end up with match figures of 14 for 149, and they were the best bowling figures by a West Indies bowler, and they remain the best bowling figures by a West Indies bowler. And shall I give you a commendation from Mike Selvey, who was opening the bowling for England? It proved his rank as one of the greatest bowlers in Test cricket. It is hard to overestimate how well he bowled. It was fast, it was straight, it was accurate, it was awesome. And so, John, I know you agree, there really couldn't be any other candidate for title of the greatest spell.
No.
Great, I think, in every way it's possible to be great, for all the reasons that we've spelt out over the course of this episode.
I agree completely. And Mikey, now we've come to the end of the game, there's another question I've been wanting to ask you. Some of my favourite photos that I've seen that are displayed around the Oval and were taken here are of your team after that game, because it was such a, it was the end of that summer, and so it really seemed like you guys had a good party after that game. Without asking you to recall any very specific details, were you having as good a time as those photos make it
we
look
had a
like
great time, and again, John, as you know, the Oval so close to Brixton, everyone from Brixton was at the ground. I know a friend of mine. He's actually from Antigua who lost his job because of that test match. He was in. Yeah, he was a. Well,
No.
he might still be. I hope so anyway. He had to leave England and go and live in New York, but he was working with British Telecom at the time, and he was a telephone operator. Because those days you couldn't dial straight overseas. You had to dial into the operator. Um, where would you like to call, and then they plug you in and that sort of thing. He knew about 6 or 7 languages. Billy is his first name, and Billy should have been at work and was in the stands, and of course, the cameras focused on the celebrations in the stands, and he was there. And Billy lost his job. He lost his job.
Oh, no.
He eventually went and lived in New
Oh,
York.
Billy.
That's why you should have gone in
Yeah,
fancy
well,
dress.
those days we didn't have too many people going anywhere
Yeah.
in fancy dress. But Billy, great guy.
Oh, that's so
Well,
good. But there's one other question, Mike, as well, just about your performance as well. Something that someone's told me, again, other bowlers have told me, was that they talk about, particularly with fast bowlers, the oval status as the last test of the summer traditionally means that fast bowlers, you didn't, all you had to do after the oval test was to get on the plane and go home, basically. So they said, in previous test matches in the series, they may have been saving themselves for the next test or elsewhere in the series, but they said at the oval you can really let rip because you don't have to worry about the rest of the series. Was that the case with you? And do you think
No,
that was
that wasn't
influential
really
on
the
your
case with
performance
me
in that
because
test?
I wasn't that tired. As I said earlier on, I missed one of the test matches. I missed the first test match. So this was just my 4th test
Yeah.
match. And I hadn't really played a lot of the county games. And England tour those days was very taxing because they played against every county. Some counties they played twice. 3-day games, you jump in the bus at the end of the 3rd day's play, you drive to the next venue and they are playing again the next day. But Lloydie had enough people in that squad that he could rotate the fast bowlers. And even if we played in those county games, we weren't really playing at full tilt. So I myself, at 22 years old again, John, you're not going to be getting that tired that easily, that quickly. So I was fine.
All right, amazing.
And Mike, just one
Sure.
last question.
Tom, go on.
Was this match? Is it one that you particularly treasure or not? Because obviously, statistically, it was your best performance. It sounds like emotionally there was a lot going on there. Is it one that you has a particular resonance for you, or is it just a blur now?
I remember a lot of things that took place in the test match, and I enjoyed the experience. But as I said earlier on, at 22 years old, I could never tell anyone that I knew everything about fast bowling and that I planned all those 14 wickets and I can dissect each one and say, yes, I did this first, then I did that. A lot of things just clicked during that test match, and a lot of things and the factors helped me with bowling fast and full. And of course, because of the rough outfield, you could get one half of the ball pretty rough pretty quickly, and then you'd keep on shining the other. And you hear people talk about reverse swing. That has been around for decades. But the television coverage those days didn't show it so that you could identify it. But reverse swing was going on in that test match, and the ball being that full and straight, the late bit of swing. If you look back, you'll see that Tony Greig actually got bowled with a full toss in one of his innings. I don't remember if it's the first or second inning because it was full straight and it swung late. So those conditions just helped me a great deal. But I think I've bowled better taking less wickets in other test matches. But that's just the nature of our sport. That was a fantastic performance. I just say no other West Indian bowlers take more than 14 wickets in a test match. And I'll relish that. I'll remember that for a very long time. But I wouldn't boast to anybody and say, oh, that I outsmarted this one and I did this and did that.
Well, it doesn't matter what you say. We're still voting for you as the bowler who delivered the greatest spell ever at the Oval. And we haven't been able to talk to W.G. Grace, and we haven't been able to talk to Jack Hobbs, and we haven't been able to talk to Jim Laker, but we have been able to talk to Michael Holding. So, Michael Holding, thank you so much for coming on. And we hope that you've all enjoyed listening to this. And, John, we will be back next week with our final episode where we look at the future of the Oval. So thank you all so much for
Yes.
listening.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
so
Thanks
much,
for having
Mikey.
me on.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mikey. Thank you so much.